My dad had been working with Porsche for quite some time and had arranged to have the very first 962 delivered to the United States. One of the great memories of my life, though, was the day we actually took delivery of the 962. It was the most beautiful thing I've ever seen. People loved it. When I'm at a racetrack and people, oh, Bobby Akin was your dad, that's amazing. God, that car was my favorite car when I was in high school. I hear that all the time. Unfortunately, life can change in the blink of an eye, and it can all be over.
Porsches have style, pedigree, and speed. For those of us that love and are passionate about Porsche, it doesn't matter which one you own or if you own one at all. In this community, all are welcome. Join us as we delve into the heart of Porsche culture, where every story is as unique as the cars themselves. I'm Bo Bachman, and this is my Porsche story.
My dad raced in drag racing and sports car SCCA stuff from a very young age, from when he first got his driver's license. He just loved everything to do with racing. In the early 70s, he started vintage racing, and then one day decided, along with Steve Earle, a good friend of his, they were good enough and they could go to Daytona and race the 24 hours. And so they bought a RSR Porsche and they went to Daytona and they finished their first race. Then they went on to Sebring and they finished 5th, and the rest was history. He went on and ran some of the biggest teams in sports car racing into the 80s.
So when did the partnership with Coca-Cola start?
The very first car to have the Coca-Cola livery was kind of an interesting story, to say the least. Daytona International Raceway, built by the France family, really came to fruition because of several partners. One of those partners was a guy named Chapman Root. The Root family owned the Coca-Cola bottling franchise for most of the South. Somebody at NASCAR decided it would be a great idea to sell the sponsorship rights to the Daytona Speedway to Pepsi. Chapman Root was not happy.
The Daytona 24-Hour Challenge is America's most grueling test of man and machine.
The 24-hour was the first race to happen at Daytona under the Pepsi sponsorship. Root wanted a car on the front row, that first race, to be covered in Coca-Cola red. And that's how it began. My dad got a phone call one day and said, Bob Akin, I want to sponsor your race car.
Bob Akin, are you anxious for the start or more concerned about survival here today?
Well, we're really ready. We've been ready all week.
That's Bob Akin there, just at the wheel, number 5. Number 5 there, the Coca-Cola sponsored Porsche, driving superbly.
After that, technically the sponsorship was over. But my dad thought, number one, the car looked great, and having a brand like Coca-Cola on the car would help generate additional sponsorship. So he just kept it on the car. 5 or 6 races in, we're at Road Atlanta, and this guy walks up to my dad and says, "Hi, are you the team owner?" And my dad says, "Yes." And he says, "Well, I work for Coca-Cola, and you can't just use our brand on your car without permission. But we like it. Come see us on Monday after the Atlanta race, and we'll work something out." And they did, and that sponsorship went on for, I think, 12 years. The rules of IMSA were changing, and the 935 was being phased out, and the 962 was clearly coming. My dad loved the 935. He loved the grit of it, the pure brawn of a 935, and the fact that it looked like something you could buy on the street, technically, right? It looked like a Porsche, but the rules were the rules, and if you were going to be competitive, you needed a new car. My dad had arranged with Porsche that he was going to get the very first 962 delivered to the United States. However, there was another guy that ran a big team, Bruce Levin. Bruce was not happy that my dad was getting chassis number 1, and he was relentless. My dad finally said to him, if you really want it that bad, I'll sell you number 1 and I'll take number 2. Bruce was like, well, how much? And my dad says, $50,000. Bruce said, I'm not doing that, and he stormed off. And then he came back an hour later with a check for 50 grand. And so we ended up with chassis number 2. One of the great memories of my life, though, was the day we actually took delivery of the 962. We got a call, it was coming into the freight area at JFK Airport, and they dropped it right onto our flatbed. We kind of did a nut and bolt check. We made sure the springs were all right and all the settings were good. We did a shakedown test and then put it on the truck and went to Charlotte.
Today, the track is tougher than Laguna or Riverside. 1,000 horsepower monsters are about to tackle Charlotte Motor Speedway,
where it entered its first race.
Now there you see the number 5 car. That is the Akin car.
And did very well, right out of the gate.
The red number 5 headed into the east banking.
And it was without question in the U.S. the most iconic 962 or prototype car ever.
Bob Akin's a veteran sports car driver. Began racing back in the 60s, then went to vintage cars, now is in the big time.
They said it was the most photographed car in IMSA history. That livery was just beautiful. 1 year almost to the day of the first race of the 962, we returned to Charlotte Motor Speedway.
Up into the 7th position moves the Akin car.
My dad was in the car, he was running well, and was headed towards turn 1.
And John Paul Jr. sliding. Look at that black rubber he's leaving there up that back tire as he swings it through that infield course.
John Paul Jr. had had an incident behind my father.
Oh, big spin on the front straight.
And a big spin going down into turn number 1 is collected another car. It is the Akin car which is crashing as he was collected by
John Paul.
John Paul, I believe, is that car that came spinning down through the grass.
Basically, the geometry was just the worst possible thing, and my dad never saw it coming. Our car did 1 360 and went head-on into a barrier.
Number 5 was being driven by its owner, the man who introduced 962s to this country.
I was absolutely certain I just watched my father die. It was that bad.
There you see number 45, and it's all over, and bad luck continues for Akin.
He's getting out, he's okay. Boy, he's a lucky man. That car was hit very, very hard, and then he ran head-on into that tire barrier.
How my dad survived that accident, nobody knows. He said when he opened his eyes, his feet were on either side of the steering wheel, up on the dashboard. When it hit the wall, it literally broke the car's back. That accident was the end of chassis 102.
And there is Akin out of his car.
Looks like he's okay. He's swinging that low, his legs to be okay. Obviously, they're the most vulnerable thing in a crash like that. Boy, he'll be an upset man because that's cost him a lot of money.
So my dad had obligations to Coca-Cola and several other sponsors. We needed to continue the season. Otherwise, frankly, he was going to have to give money back. So he called Porsche. There was a backroom deal that they would buy the wrecked chassis for the exact same amount as a new chassis. So we went on and built a new car and continued racing for the season. We continued campaigning the newer 962 for several years and had amazing success with the car.
Bob Akin strapping up to get back in here and try to win.
the Charlotte Grand Prix.
They won Sebring in '86. The drivers who drove it did extremely well. As my dad wound down his professional career, he began vintage racing again. He kind of went back to where it began in many ways.
Bob Akin is the winner.
Unfortunately, we lost him at a vintage race in Road Atlanta. Without question, the darkest day of my life. Not only was my dad, but he was my best friend. Several years after my father had passed away, it was Rennsport 5. My phone rings and I pick up the phone, and it's Kevin Jeanette, who is a fabulous restoration guy that just does brilliant work on race cars. He says, "Hey Bobby, what are you doing for Rennsport?" And I said, "Well, I'm producing the show for Speed." And he says, "How would you like to drive chassis 102? I said, "Kevin, 102 doesn't exist." And he says, "Bobby, we found it. We fixed it better than new. And the guy who owns it wants you to be the first to drive it." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. When I saw the car rolling onto the liftgate on the truck to get unloaded, I felt like I was seeing an old friend again. It takes my breath away, even thinking about it now. To be reunited with something that had meant so much to me for so many years literally brought me to tears. I did the race, I passed some guys. Again, I was trying to be pretty careful. I remember after the checker and you're on that cool-off lap and people were waving, and I pulled into the pit lane, into the paddock, and opened the door, and the first thing I see is my 5-year-old son comes running up to me. And it was just so special. Everybody was just overjoyed with what we had done. Bringing that car back to life was just amazing. It will always be one of the greatest moments of my life.